Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. This is Luis Jobel from Australia, and we're bringing a special Notas Teologicas or theological notes today. And this involves Dr. Paul Copan from Florida in the United States. So we don't only have Jose as our American friend. We also have another one now, and today we're gonna be talking about what he does and he's working, and instead of me telling you, or well, what I would like to tell you first is that he has a lot of books. I started going on Amazon just to see how many books you had, and I had some books like to show you so you know that it's true. I have some of your books. That's your interpretation, true for you, not for me, and contending with Christian critics as well, which is I like this one. You edited, so you have edited over 30 books, and written and edited over 30 books. So I'm very glad that you have accepted this invitation to be with us. This will be later. This will be subtitle in Spanish, so our Spanish audience can also have a taste of what we are, we're talking about here. So Paul, can you start by introducing yourself and telling us a bit of your background, please?
Sure. Well, I grew up in a pastor's home, a family of 7 children, and my father was born in the Ukraine. My mother from Latvia. They met after the Second World War in Germany, and then came over to the United States. My dad, they got married, and my dad enrolled in seminary, and I was born in Cleveland, Ohio, where my dad was pastor of a Russian-Ukrainian Baptist church. And so grew up in that subculture, and in high school, I went to a Christian high school, mostly public schools early on, and then a Christian private high school, and there I became exposed to apologetics for the first time, which was very helpful for me. And then I went to Columbia International University and got an undergrad in biblical studies, and always sensed that I would be involved in some sort of ministry work. And so I went on to get a Master of Divinity at Trinity Seminary. And while I was pursuing my Master of Divinity, I took a philosophy class with Stuart Hackett, who had been a mentor and one who strongly influenced William Lane Craig, the Christian philosopher. And so I took a course with him, and of course William Craig also happened to be teaching there, and so I took classes from him as well. And so I got a double master's, one in divinity, one in philosophy of religion. And so I went on staff. I met my wife in the Chicago area where I was going to Trinity, and we were married, and then I went on staff with the church in upstate New York for 6.5 years, and I found that having a degree in philosophy was very useful, especially as I was a volunteer staff worker for InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, which works on Christian university campuses, works on university campuses. And so I found that having a background in philosophy just connected with people. It was just a good platform to have a door for the gospel. So my wife and I were talking about, well, what would be the next step to take? And we'd always been thinking about missionary work overseas. And she said, well, what about getting a PhD? And she was thinking theology. I was thinking philosophy. And so I said, yeah, that's great. And of course, we had 4 children, 4 and under at the time, but ended up going to Marquette University in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And so got my PhD there, and then worked with Ravi Zacharias International Ministries for 5 years or so. And then in 2004 came down here to as the Pledger Family Chair of Philosophy and Ethics at Palm Beach Atlantic University. So I've been here since then, and have really enjoyed the work that I do, and been blessed to do work in the area of biblical studies and theology and philosophy, and trying to bring some of these areas together for elucidating various questions that come up that where these disciplines intersect. And so yeah, I've been thrilled to be here, and glad to be down here in Florida at this time for teaching at Palm Beach Atlantic University.
Would you consider yourself a Floridian by now?
Not quite. I love. I lived. My wife is from New England.
Oh,
She's
cool.
from the Boston area, and I spent a lot of time in Connecticut. So we really love that part of the country. So not Floridians, but we've had to make some adjustments, but it's been okay.
No, it's so it's maybe Jose has a question on this regard. Yes.
Yeah. I've noticed that. Well, you've been busy all these years, Dr. Copan. I'm really impressed with the work that you've done through the years. And one of the reasons why I thought that this interview with you would be really beneficial is because at this time, the only name you hear out there is say William Lane Craig is the first one that you hear in Latin America. Well, we wanna open our audience to other philosophers, and I think that you're one of the people that we would benefit from learning and hearing from you and getting to know you. That way we can have a different understanding. And as Louis said, there's a mentality and a lot of people that we meet that okay, so we're gonna focus on one area, and this is the best area to focus, and we're gonna put all our eggs in one basket.
Oh, he's a oh, look.
We
Hopefully he comes back.
can.
Yeah, it's a little
It's a
slow.
little slow. It's a. So I hope he realizes what's going on. I think he's coming
We
back.
can do.
Yes.
Okay, did I lose?
Yes, you
Did
like.
I
Yeah, you
lose
slowed it down a
myself?
little bit. It was hard to.
I like
you know,
how I like how you stop with your tongue outside.
Yeah. Anyways, so I don't know if you heard what I said, but yeah, we just want people to get to know you and have other perspectives, not only one philosopher out there, which I think is always good because we can hear other perspectives and learn from other teachers. Yeah. And the second question we have for you, Dr. Copan, is well, it's kind of a two-part. Would you tell us who is your favorite philosopher and your favorite theologian?
Okay. Well, favorite philosopher is Jesus, but that's probably one that you already take for granted. Of course, the wisest and most intelligent man who ever walked the earth. But in terms of just philosophers, I do an ancient philosopher I like is Augustine, who used philosophy well. He was influenced by Ambrose, a Neoplatonist, influenced Christian philosopher. And it was through this philosophical input as he wrestled with the problem of evil, as he wrestled with how could he make sense of God as a spiritual substance, that he found much that Ambrose gave to him very helpful. But in terms of a modern philosopher, I'd say Alvin Plantinga. He has been a leading philosopher. Of course, he's already had a significant career in influencing and writing and so forth. But I appreciated the fact that when he stepped in to his philosophical career, he was unafraid in challenging naturalism and challenging this what's called verificationism. In order to believe something, in order to know something, you have to be able to verify it. And of course, he challenged that by saying you can't verify that very statement. And he seemed, he's just unafraid in challenging what I think a lot of people were afraid to say They wanted to just fit into what the mentality of the day was during what was called logical positivism's heyday. And he led the way for many people. He started the Society of Christian Philosophers. He's also one who has, when he writes with great humor. He's very engaging. He doesn't do dry philosophy. He does very lively philosophy. I mean, he's a rigorous thinker. But I also appreciate the fact that he is gracious, that he's someone who's been very personable. I've had the pleasure to know him, to interact with him, and so forth, and just has been one whom I've highly respected. So that's in terms of philosophy, I would say Alvin Plantinga. In terms of theologians, I think a model theologian for me has been, I mean, to talk about, say, contemporaries. Somebody I like is Kevin Van Hooser at Trinity Seminary. He had been a professor of mine when I was there back in the late 80s, in the mid 80s. But I'd say someone who's been a real model for me has been Jonathan Edwards, philosopher, theologian, 1703 to 1758, lived in New England, and also was president at Princeton University, a short time there. But I've appreciated him as a role model for being a pastor. Of course, he and is also a missionary. Is a very rigorous thinker, though, someone who engaged philosophically, but also sought to do theology and philosophy to the glory of God. He was someone who was consumed with the glory of God and used philosophical resources to assist in the theological task. And so, just for a number of reasons, I've appreciated the work of Jonathan Edwards, his keenness of mind, his spiritual devotion, his ability to be creative theologically. So I would say Jonathan Edwards has been a real role model for me.
It's very interesting because here in Australia, I don't know if you're aware that at Ridley, they have a Jonathan Edwards Center because it's a big Riz Bazan, who's the history teacher there, history lecturer. He lectured me as well. He majored in Jonathan Edwards, so it's very strong. And I like what you said first, that Jesus, your favorite philosopher would be Jesus, because people don't tend to see Jesus as a philosopher. They tend to see him as a religious leader, but he was a philosopher. We can say how to live. I mean, on ethics. People don't tend to see Jesus as an ethical philosopher, and which he was and he is.
Yeah, and I wrote a book called A Little Book for New Philosophers, and the theologian N.T. Wright said that Jesus, as well as the Apostle Paul, would have been considered philosophers in the Mediterranean world at that time. That they were, of course, Jesus spoke in terms of metaphysics and epistemology, the study of knowledge, and ethics, as you said. And
there again, Dr. Copan, those are the issues in our Latin American community. Once you in some circles, which is a big circles, if you mention the word metaphysics, that creates cheaters to people, because some teachers have taught that that's wrong, and I said, well, metaphysics is what you see, and that's why, like Jose said, we like to introduce the Spanish-speaking culture, Spanish-speaking church, Latin American church, that you don't have to be afraid of philosophy. You don't have to be afraid of these terms.
Yeah, in fact, you can tell them that everyone is a philosopher. Everyone has a view of reality, which is metaphysics. We believe in the reality of certain things, whether it be just a material world or material and spiritual world. That's metaphysics. We all have a way of, we believe that we can know through certain pathways, that we can know, or some people say we can't know. Well, that's taking a view about epistemology, or the study of knowledge. We all take a stance on right and wrong. Some people say there is no such thing as right and wrong. Well, you're still taking a stance, a philosophical stance. on the matter of ethics. So these are inescapable areas. We are inescapably philosophers.
Yes.
And everyone has a worldview. Everyone has a philosophy of life. And the question is, how do you justify your philosophy of life? How do you sustain that? How do you support that? Which worldview makes the best sense of the way things are really are?
So, yes, Jose, you want to add something? Or?
No, go ahead.
Yes. Our next question will be, what is apologetics and why the need for apologetics?
Okay.
I think for a Christian, mainly, why we need and what it is. What is it?
Okay, sure. Well, there are a couple of different definitions that we could appeal to. I think a common one that people will refer to is it's a defense of the Christian faith. I like to put it a little bit more in a more nuanced way. It's the art and science of defending the Christian faith. There's a science. I think that's what people mostly understand. That there are public reasons, accessible reasons, objective reasons for the Christian faith. We appeal to argument, to historical evidences, and so forth to support the Christian faith. But there's also an art to doing apologetics. There's the relational component. We want to know with whom we're dealing, to whom we're relating. So there's a relational component. Where is this person coming from? How did he come to believe the things that he or she has? There's a requirement of discerning what the person's needs are. He may be giving you an argument against God from evil. And the real issue may be that there are some deeper felt needs that he himself is not addressing. Maybe there's been a broken relationship with a father. It's very interesting that many of the world's leading atheists.
Yes, you have a chapter one of your books.
Have had negative, non-existent relationships with their own fathers, and so I think so often we think that all that needs to be addressed is the intellectual dimension, but we forget about the personal. We forget about the some of the deep emotional areas, the psychological dimensions. And also people need love. People don't just need answers. People need to know that they're appreciated. And we need to display the love of God as we engage with other people. So there's a host of things that could be said here when it comes to the art of defending the Christian faith. But I think just at a very basic level, being a good listener. We need to be, as James says, quick to listen and slow to speak. And we as Christians often reverse those. We're very quick to speak and very slow to listen. So engaging in apologetics, it's the art and science of defending the Christian faith. But I think that, as Dallas Willard said, apologetics is fundamentally the task of doubt removal, to help both the believer and the unbeliever remove doubts in order to enter into either deeper discipleship or just plain old discipleship, being a follower of Jesus Christ. So removing those areas of doubts, and Dallas Willard speaks of that in terms of just relating to people, sitting down and finding out what the source of their doubt is. We have, so there's need for apologetics within the church because a lot of believers have doubts. In fact, one theologian, Avery Dulles, said that there's an infidel inside of each believer. That there's an unbeliever inside of each of us.
Dulles was great. Dulles was great. Dr. Copan. We've done a few programs on apologetics, and what we point out is that, well, the main reason why we do apologetics is because we want to get to the gospel. We want to share the gospel to people, and there are some apologists who are enthusiasts that they do a lot of apologetics, but they that's all they do. They never get to the reason, le raison d'être of apologetics. So what would you say to that?
Yeah, well, as I was just saying, with regard to Dallas Willard, he said we need to be helping people either move to discipleship if they're unbelievers, and to move into deeper discipleship if they're believers. So it's all gospel related, and so our apologetic isn't an end in itself. It is something that helps us to either draw near to God through having our questions answered and having them answered in the right way, or to have some of those doubts that we've been struggling with as believers removed so that we can be freed up to enter more fully into the life that God has for us, living under the gospel. So I think that you're right to point out that apologetics is not beating people up for Jesus. Apologetics is ultimately or should be gospel-centered, gospel-focused. It should have evangelism as at least when you're talking with unbelievers. It should have evangelism as a fundamental goal. We want to defend the gospel before outsiders so that they too may worship Jesus as we worship him. That oftentimes people who engage in apologetics have a very pugnacious, very kind of a fighting spirit. That they just want to win arguments, and that's not going about things in a Jesus-centered way. We may win an intellectual battle, but lose a person, and so we need to be careful about how we undertake our conversations with unbelievers. A lot of people, they like to get into giving a reason for the hope that lies within them, as 1 Peter 3:15 says, but they don't do so with gentleness and respect, and that is a very critical component as we engage in apologetics. There's a relational dimension that, as I've emphasized.
And I enjoy your pastoral approach, Dr. Copan. In this thing about winning arguments, going back to our Latin American setting, the last 10, 15 years, there's been a revival of Calvinism within our ranks. Even I had my cage stage of Calvinism myself. And they were using Calvinism in order to answer all the opposition, all the questions from Christianity, from that they pose against Christianity. And now that apologetics is speaking up, and actually one of your books, along with Dr. William Lane Craig, Ex Nihilo, is being I think it's going to be it's going to be published soon. If not, has been published already. In Spanish?
Yeah, it's published already.
Yes.
It's published, yes.
Yeah. So people are picking up now with apologetics, and now they're using apologetics as they used to use Calvinism in order to. So they're going into this apologetics cage stage that everybody is using, and I think that, like you said, it's not. You can do a well apologetic argument, but you can lose the person, and people have not thought about the image of God in the individual. They just think of the thoughts that I have to destroy, bring every thought captive under Christ. Yes, but you have to bring the people along as well.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
Yeah, and one of the things that I emphasize is that we need a holistic apologetic, not simply one that considers the intellectual dimension, but also what about the existential? What about people who struggle with guilt and shame and the fear of death and the need for forgiveness? What about people who are seeking significance and security? And also there are people who have a more, C.S. Lewis, he came to faith because of the use of imagination. He read the writer George MacDonald, and he came to see the Christian faith looking at it from another angle, kind of stepping outside of what he himself believed, and was able to envision how things looked from another vantage point, and he came to see how this made sense. And I think one Christian writer, Louise Cowan, she taught at University of Dallas, and she came to faith through reading the classics, Dostoevsky and Tolstoy and so forth. She came in touch with her own humanity by reading them, and she found that through reading them, the gospel made sense. And so she said it wasn't through rational argument, it wasn't through reading theology textbooks or anything. It was really through literature that she came to see how the Christian faith made sense of the human condition and how it addressed and answered the problem of the human condition and the need for forgiveness and reconciliation with God and so forth. So there are different ways that God can use to speak to us, different ways of engaging the gospel, not just intellectually. So we need a more holistic understanding of how God can speak to people's hearts. Apologetics is important. It's a neglected ministry within local churches, but it's not the only thing going on. We need to be wise about how we engage people with the gospel.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think you answered our next, what was going to be our next question, Dr. Copan. That's great. But so I have another one. So one of the reasons why we wanted to have you on was because there's certain situations in our Latin American context and yeah, so we would like to ask you in our context, what advice would you give for students of apologetics, say, that are financial limitations?
Yeah.
What advice would you give to them? And because one of the things that they'll say, well, yeah, I want to study apologetics, but I don't have the resources.
Yeah.
Monetary resources mainly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I know that money can be a limitation. I think perhaps in a Latin context where you have people who have been influenced by apologetics who are in the business world and they see the value of that, well, I think providing resources for funding for people to do study in apologetics, maybe funding a center for Christian apologetics in some associated with some sort of institution where people can get good, solid training, and they can come to be part of a something greater that has been supported by a work that has been done. And I think a lot of creativity is called for here, where you bring together people who are have a business sense, but who love and appreciate apologetics, and can fund something like this. Or it can be a matter of teaming up with, say, an institution here in the United States, perhaps, and bringing apologetics to Latin America through people who are very much interested in having apologetics in their own context. So, for example, a year and a half ago, my wife and we went to Colombia, South America, to Armenia, and actually Salento, and we were associated with a Christian and Missionary Alliance Bible school there, and faculty from the School of Ministry here at Palm Beach Atlantic University. We fly down, on Spirit Airlines. My wife and I went down, and it's a very cheap flight. And then someone took care of our housing while we were in Colombia. And during that entire week, I was giving lectures in apologetics and was being translated. And then other members of our faculty in the School of Ministry have also been coming down. Again, we don't get paid to do this. We just have our flight taken care of and our meal, room and board taken care of while we're there. And then we're teaching the entire week. And so basically you can get an entire ministry degree course done through this sort of cycling process. So we'll come down for a week at a time, teach there, and the students get the benefit of our lecture notes and everything. And so we've been working together with this seminary or this Bible college or Bible school in Colombia to do this teaching. So I think that there may be creative ways in which this can be undertaken. And here's an example of one that is taking place in a Latin American setting,
yes,
and has proven very fruitful. And now we're working to get an online course going for ministry. It's not apologetics specifically, though it does include a course that I've done in apologetics. But I could envision that sort of a thing happen where at a more intentional apologetics level, where this sort of a thing can be done. So I would encourage you all to think creatively about how this sort of a thing can be done, conferring with people who are engaged in apologetics, who would be willing to share their resources and their time in a Latin American setting, and bring some of those resources down to you, wherever you are, to assist in this way.
Well, thank you.
That's excellent.
And our semi-final question would be, in your opinion, what is the place of reason in theology?
Well, reason has historically been very important in engaging in the philosophical task. Even in one philosopher who taught at Princeton Seminary, Diogenes Allen, he wrote a book in which he said that every major Christian doctrine has been influenced by philosophical categories, and in order to understand theology properly and doctrine properly, you'll have to know something about philosophy. And so it is, there is a place for reason. Some people pit faith against reason. Some people pit faith against evidence. And it's interesting, you see the scriptures don't do that sort of a thing. They bring them together. Some people they'll say, look at what Jesus said to Thomas, that blessed are you, blessed are those who have not seen and yet still believe. You've believed because you've seen, but blessed are those who haven't seen and they still believe. Well, of course, Thomas should have believed his fellow, the fellow disciples who were telling them, "We have seen the Lord," and he still refused to believe. And it's interesting too that in John chapter 20, the very next verses say that Jesus performed many other signs. But these signs, these miracles that are related in the Gospel of John, these have been written, these evidences, these testimonies of these signs have been written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life through his name. There is a connection between the evidences, the signs, and believing. So these evidences, these signs can lead to belief. But reason is a support in the gospel. It is a support in theology. And the theologian Anselm spoke about a faith-seeking understanding.
Yes.
That yes, by having faith, by having our minds opened by God, we see things differently than the unbeliever will, because we have the Spirit of God. We will see things with new eyes. But it doesn't mean that we shut off reason in this process. C.S. Lewis said that he believed in Christianity like he believed the sun exists. He says, I believe not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. That the Christian faith brings illumination, and this means engaging the mind. It means engaging reason. The Christian faith brings illumination. It brings insight. It makes better sense of things than the alternatives. And so we need to see not pit faith against reason, but we see them as friends. And of course, reason serves the gospel. It serves theology. But again, it's not to be seen as an enemy. Some people quote Martin Luther, our friend, who called reason a whore. Well, that's reason was when it's called a whore or a harlot, that is because it is taken to be, in a sense, it takes the place of the rule of God, the sovereignty of God, and so forth. That it is as though it could somehow be independent of God or some other stance that we take. No, we're always going to be exerting faith, and however we use reason, we're going to be doing reason from a certain point of view, a certain perspective, a certain faith perspective or trust perspective. That this is inescapable, and so the question is, which faith perspective, which worldview, which philosophy of life makes the most sense of things. And so we see that the gospel does fit or make better sense than the alternatives. So again, so Martin Luther also said that he liked the philosopher Cicero, for example, and so he drew on philosophical resources. So it wasn't as though he was opposed to philosophy or reason, but it just needed to have its rightful place in the order of things.
Yes. And I think also Tertullian also say what does Athens have to do with Jerusalem? So.
Right, and again, he himself, even though he pitted faith against philosophy, he actually did a lot of philosophizing himself.
Yes, that's right.
So it wasn't as though he somehow was just a blind theist who just believed and didn't use reason. No, he exerted quite a bit of reasoning in his works.
Yes.
Yeah, well, they used to call Martin Luther the philosopher. So the last question we have.
He was influenced by Augustine, who was very philosophical in his understanding.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Our last question, Dr. Copan, is given so many excellent apologists out there, Zacharias, yourself, Dr. William Lane Craig, Mike Licona, Habermas. What can a student of apologetics bring to the table?
Yeah. Well, as Jesus said, the harvest is so plentiful and the laborers are few. And apologetics is going to be needful both inside the church and outside the church. And so we need people engaging in apologetics to help remove doubts, to help Christians be reinforced in their faith, to be encouraged in their faith, to not to be subject to corrosive doubting all the time, but to find that through their doubts they can be strengthened in their faith. And again, not all doubts are intellectual and so forth. And so we need to help people discern which are intellectual doubts and maybe which are emotional doubts, where people maybe have certain deeper insecurities that need to be addressed, not simply thinking that it's just a matter of intellectual answers or something. We need more than just high-profile apologists. We need people who are in the workplace to open up doors for the gospel through apologetics, teachers in public schools, people who are involved in business, influencing their colleagues for the gospel. And sometimes it's a matter of teaming up with others who are more high profile. When I worked on staff with a church in upstate New York, I hadn't gotten my PhD in philosophy, but I was bringing in people like William Lane Craig and J.P. Moreland to our local areas, and they would do debates and public talks and so forth, and do question and answer time. I think this is also very important for us, and even pastors and church leaders who believe in the importance of apologetics. I think it's good to maybe even after a service to open up the floor for question and answer times. Tim Keller in New York City did that very effectively. Just speaking and then opening up a time for question and answer afterwards. I think this gives people a sense of confidence in the gospel, that the gospel is able to handle these sorts of questions. So we can do apologetics at all sorts of different levels. There could be all sorts of ways in which we can engage with people. So even if we're not professional apologists, we can engage in the apologetic task. It's needful. It's not the only answer, but it is an important one that it's often neglected.
I like your answer, and like what the question that I told you before we started recording, that I wanted to ask you about. This Molinism is taking over in many parts of Latin America, of the Latin American context, and some people have taken it. Some people have even ditched Calvinism literally, and then embraced Molinism in any. The other one that the other position that believes that you are totally destroyed after judgment, the pronunciation annihilism. So they have ditched Calvinism and they have embraced these two positions. And they have in some of their blogs and some Facebook posts, which are very good people, they are saying that if you understand this, either annihilationism and Molinism, both camps say if you understand this theological position, the whole Bible will open up. But in this case, I like to ask you about Molinism. How would you answer to that claim, Dr. Copan?
Yeah. Well, first, what is modernismos? What is
Molinismo.
Molinism? And I think just very briefly, just to summarize it, God, who knows all the alternatives, all the possibilities, if human beings are placed in certain circumstances, God knows what we would do in those circumstances, and then creates the actual world in which human free choices are not violated, but are actually utilized in the fulfillment of God's redemptive purposes, such that God's purposes are accomplished without overriding or nullifying genuine, robust, libertarian human freedom. And so, for example, when David is at Keilah in 1 Samuel 23, David asks the Lord, he said, if Saul comes to the city, will the men of Keilah turn me over to him? And God says, yes, they will. So if this were to happen, then they would turn you over. And so does David do. He leaves.
Yes.
He knows what those men would freely do, and so he leaves. That's just an example of, and again, you can see this illustrated throughout the scriptures. That these counterfactuals, if this had happened, then that would have taken place. And so I think that it captures a fundamental insight in Scripture. Molinism does, and it emphasizes on the one hand, God knows all the possibilities, and then and what humans would freely do. That it is up to human beings to make these choices, but that God, knowing how human beings would choose if placed in certain conditions or circumstances, He creates the actual world in which that freedom is not overridden, but yet God's redemptive purposes are accomplished, even using evil choices of human beings, like the crucifixion of Christ, to bring about His redemptive purposes, again carried out by free moral agents. So again, I would see that this is the fundamental picture here. I think it brings light. I think it brings illumination as we read portions of Scripture. But to say the entire gospel hangs on this, I think is stating it way too, is overstating it way too much. And so I would just pull back on those sorts of assertions. I think it does bring insight when it comes to salvation, when it comes to issues of sovereignty and human freedom and so forth. But people can still be faithful followers of Jesus Christ, not holding to Molinism. They can be wonderful evangelists. They can do great work in the church. Before Luis de Molina came on the scene, people were faithful followers of Jesus Christ, obviously, and they, even though they didn't have this way of seeing the bigger picture, and certainly wrestling with certain tensions, they still faithfully carried out God's work, and God was well pleased with them. And so let's make sure that we keep the picture in its proper perspective and not make a certain model for understanding divine sovereignty and human responsibility. Let's not make sure that we don't make this the overarching picture that you can't be a Christian unless you believe in Molinism or something like that. People do that with Calvinism and so on.
Yes.
I think these sorts of things can be very, very dangerous, very divisive, and I think we need to have a more generous understanding of how God works and of how God puts up with all of us, despite our doctrinal limitations.
Jose,
that's a great answer.
Okay.
That is a great answer. Yeah,
Yes.
and it's becoming a divisive issue, and that's one of the reasons why we came up with this question. Actually, Luis came up with this question because it has, it's. We could be a little crazy, our Latinos, us Latinos. So sometimes we need to get a grip on reality. You know what I mean? So that's all I have. I appreciate the time, and it's a great opportunity to have you and to meet you. I will probably see you in November at the Evangelical Theological Society if you're planning on going. It's San Diego this time, so
yes. Okay, sounds good.
Yeah. I'm
Yeah.
going to be there myself. So
Well, is there
Okay.
any way if people want to contact you or know more about Paul Copan, is there any way to contact you, Dr. Copan? Can you give us a plug?
Yeah, well, I
your
appreciate that.
home address, so we
No.
can go and then
Yes,
visit
come
you.
and visit.
Oh, okay.
Come join us for pancakes on Saturday morning.
No.
If you want to look, my website is paulcopan.com, and people can, and have contacted me through that. Also, I post regularly at Facebook. I have an official Facebook page, and so I'm often posting on what I'm doing, projects I'm working on, places where I'm speaking, and so forth. So that gives a little bit more of a picture of what I'm up to.
Any plans to coming down to Australia? Have you been to Australia before?
Well, you have not because you ask not.
Okay. Well,
You have to-
I'll see
you
what
have
I
to
can do.
set that up.
Haven't been to Australia, but would love to come.
I'll see what I can do.
All right.
Thank you for
Sounds
your
great.
time, Dr. Copan. It's
Thank you,
been
Dr.
really great.
Copan.
Thank you
God bless.
for being available to us. It's very early in Florida. It's even earlier in California, and here in Australia it's 10 o'clock at night Monday. So I'd like to thank you, and thank you, Jose, too, also for waking up so early and missing some work, so we can
Yeah.
Well,
accomplish this.
I'm actually at work. I gotta
Oh.
go back.
Okay. All right. Thank you very
Well,
much.
good to
and-
be with both of you, gentlemen.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
God bless
you.
you.
God bless.
Gracias.
Bye.
Gracias. Adiós.
Gracias.